Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Leah. I'm the administrative assistant here at Africa Fire Mission, and I just want to welcome everybody to today's training. It's going to be really great. We have Howard Cohen back with us again, and so it's always such a treat when we have him presenting with us. And so you guys are all in for a really good session. But before we start, I do just want to give out a couple of the normal reminders that I give out every week. I'm sure everyone is tired of me talking about it, but we got to go through it every week. So I just want to remind everyone to please stay muted throughout the training because these are recorded and then posted on our YouTube channel later on. And so when everyone is muted throughout, it just makes the audio a little bit crisper during that video as well as during the session. It's hard to understand the speaker if everyone else is unmuted and you can hear all that background noise. It just makes the rest of the training go a little bit smoother. As well as I want to remind everybody that the name that you see on your screen will be the name that you have on your certificate. If you attend 70% of the training, which looks like 45 minutes as long as it's an hour-long training. So if you attend that 45 minutes, then you will get a certificate of attendance at the end. And so the name that you see on your screen will be the name on that certificate. And so if you don't want it to be the name that you see on your screen, please change it now, and it makes it a lot easier. As well as if you are listening or watching in a group of people, please email me at leah@Africa Fire Mission. And it just makes it a little bit easier if you email me. So I have that in writing, as you could say that you guys are all listening in a group, and then I can give everybody in the group certificates. But with all that being said, I am going to hand it off to Jose, our fire safety advocate, and he has just a little word of encouragement for you guys.
Thank you so much, Leah. Truly appreciate everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm on the road and I'm going to the office, but I can't stop encouraging us all. And my encouragement of today is from Colossians chapter 3, verse 23. It says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord. No, Lord, not for human masters. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. So, guys, my encouragement is basically just to let you know that whatever you're engaged in, you're actually doing it for God. Whatever you're doing, do it like you're serving God. Like right now, you're in class. You might know, yes, you are gaining that knowledge, but the truth of the matter, you're actually working for God's creation. So don't be discouraged. Don't feel like you're doing it for nothing. You're actually doing it for something. So even though you're with your family and you're serving your children, serve them with love, serve them with joy. Let them know that you are serving the Lord. And whatever you're doing, like protecting life and property, it is for God's creation. So stay woke, stay aware that God wants you to serve him, that God created you to serve him. All right, that's the encouragement of the day. And I wish you all the best. See you in class. And back to you, Leah.
Thank you so much for that, Jose. Thank you for, no matter, you always persevere. You always give us a word of encouragement, even if you're on the road and I know you're traveling. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult, but we really appreciate you still taking the time and giving us a good word. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Mr. Howard Cohen, and you can take it away. Oh, you're muted.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Thank you for being willing to share some of your time with me. Let me share my screen with you so I can get started. Let's see. What are you seeing my screen? Which screen are you seeing? Leah,
We are seeing your slides, but I can
Yes.
also see all the slides to the side of it.
Got it. Okay. Let me, okay. You get this out of the way.
Now I can just see your slide.
Yeah. Okay, let me size up this green box just right. Should just see my slide now, right?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, good. So, hey, everybody. Today's session is going to be very sort of narrowly focused on what I'm going to call it, what I call the big three systems necessary to keep people alive. They fall into this category of teachings that I'm going to be doing called Austere First Aid. Austere, and I'll explain a little bit more about that as I go through this. But first of all, I need to offer my thanks. Thank you to you, all of you, for sharing your time and your with me today. Thank you for your service in the fire service world and as first responders. Thank you to all the people who've taught me and on whose shoulders I stand. Basically, everything I know because someone taught it to me. And thank you to Africa Fire Mission for creating this opportunity, both for me and for you. I really love having this opportunity to teach with all of you. So, getting on to the topic, Austere First Aid. So this is what Austere First Aid is. This is a definition. It's first aid training provided for in a low resource environment where access to definitive care may be severely delayed or completely inaccessible. In other words, austere, you don't have much to work with, but you're going to try and save this person's life. So here's the thing. Not all firefighters are emergency medical technicians or paramedics, but often we are the first responders to scenes where it is necessary to provide life-saving first aid. In addition, often we are called upon to provide first aid without a lot of resources. Therefore, it's not only important for all firefighters to have at least a basic knowledge of first aid, we must also have a good understanding of the mechanics of keeping a person alive when more advanced care is not readily available. The purpose of today's webinar is to transmit an understanding of what I call the three big systems. Over the weeks and months ahead, my goal is to dive deeper into austere first aid training skills. For example, how to splint somebody, how to deal with medical problems when you're not anywhere near help. In any case, in no way should today's session be considered all the first aid training you need. However, with the basic and limited information that I will be sharing and no other training, you will have the knowledge to potentially save someone's life. So, let me give you some examples of austere first aid situations. It's an accident scene far from a medical clinic or hospital. And from what I understand, for a lot of you, where you do your firefighting and your first responding, that describes your community, your environment. You may be hours from a medical clinic, or it may be difficult to get there. I remember when I was in Kenya last year, there was I was talking to a paramedic who said he drove around for 8 hours with a patient in the back of his ambulance, trying to find a hospital that will accept this person. I don't know how common that is, but this is a person who would need to know some basic, some important skills to keep that person alive. You respond to a building collapse and people are trapped inside. You're not going to get them out in a hurry, but you can still keep them alive. And that's the goal. A boat at sea, long ways from getting to land or to a medical clinic. You're in the mountains someplace. Somebody has an accident and you're called in to help them. There's no easy way in and there's no easy way out. Or you're simply in the bush somewhere and getting to them is a challenge. So these are just some examples of where austere first aid skills come in handy. Okay, so the first thing you do upon arriving at an accident is to always always, and at the risk of repeating myself, always, you need to do a scene size up. You know that from as firefighters, you do your 360 around that burning structure, but when you go to an accident scene, you need to do the same thing. You need to make sure that you're not going to rush into the situation and create more problems by becoming another victim. I had an instructor early on in my days in first aid training who used to say, when you arrive at the accident scene, the first thing you do is sit down and smoke a cigarette. Now, I don't smoke, and I don't know whether you do, and I'm not advocating smoking a cigarette. But the point he was trying to make was, you got to keep yourself from rushing in before you had taken the time to make sure that the scene is safe. Regardless of your level of technical first aid training or medical knowledge, when responding to an incident that involves injuries, your first task is to gather as much information as you can about the situation. This is called size up. Okay. So your primary survey, that's what this is really all about. You arrive on the scene of an accident. You're going to do your 360, as I just said. And basically, your scene size up at an accident is you need to ask yourself, what's trying to kill me on the scene? Are they cars that are zipping by? Are there animals that I need to be concerned about? What about the environment? Is it really hot? Is it really cold? Is there potential of rock fall? Is there flooding? Is there a hazmat situation? Is there a hostile situation going on? All these are things that you need to figure out in your initial size up. What's trying to kill you? As I said in the previous slide, and at the risk of repeating myself, always, always, always do a thorough scene size up. It is so critical that you assess the risks and dangers before rushing in to administer aid. Okay, once you've done your initial scene size up, you need to also continue to maintain a high level of situational awareness. This is no different than on the fire ground, but sometimes when we're dealing with accidents and injuries, we get caught up in the people screaming and the pain, oh, I'm hurt, or we see blood and we almost panic in our response. Okay, you made the scene, you've assured yourself that the scene is safe. Now it's time to determine info, like how many people are part of the incident and what kinds of injuries are you dealing with. It is easy to get fixated on patients who are calling out in pain, or overlook those who are unconscious or who are not visible. For example, people get thrown from cars at car accidents, and they might end up under other vehicles or tumble into high grass or undergrowth. If it is night, you might easily overlook someone. It is also easy to rush to aid a person whose injuries appear more life-threatening than they are. For example, someone who's bleeding from a superficial head injury, while someone else nearby has stopped breathing. Which is more important? Superficial head injury might bleed a lot, but you're not going to die from that. But a person who has stopped breathing, they've got about 2 to 3 minutes before they're done. As you go around to the patients, introduce yourself. Make sure people know who you are. Hey, I'm Howard. I'm a firefighter trained in emergency aid. I'm here to help you. Is that okay with you? This is a really important step in your assessment because A, it is calming, and B, if they answer you, it tells you that they are breathing, their airway is cleared, their heart is beating, and they are most likely not neurologically impaired. In other words, they may be banged up, but their life is not in immediate danger. Okay, you've done your scene size up. You've identified yourself as you're working yourself around. Now, as you're working your way to the patients, try to find out how many people you should be looking for. Where are they? And as you're doing this, also do a quick triage to rule out folks who do not appear to have life-threatening injuries. As I said before, when you identify yourself and ask how you're doing, you can get a lot of information from your patients. And lastly, as the initial part of your primary survey, don't forget to don appropriate PPE. You don't want to make yourself another patient, either in the short term or the long term. So whatever you have, make sure you use it. All right, second part of the primary survey. This is where we get into the nuts and bolts. These are the three big systems. After you've made sure the scene is safe for you and your patients, you begin checking them out. What you are looking for in the primary assessment is whether or not the three main life supporting functions are compromised. These are the respiratory, circulatory, and nervous system. Any problems involving any one of these three represents an immediate threat to the life of the patient and must be addressed immediately. And just to be clear, respiratory means the lungs and the ability to breathe. Circulatory is heart, veins, and blood. And the nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. I'm going to show you a video, short video now, on how the lungs work. Now, I hope that, for some of you, I hope this is just review. And you're thinking to yourself, I know all this stuff. And that's great. We have to review all the time. It's easy to forget. I just recently went to a refresher course on Austere First Aid. 3 days I was there. We were going over all these things. I do that every 3 years. And you know what? Every time I go back, I seem to have forgotten something I learned before. So, and for those of you for whom this is new, I'm glad to be introducing you to something new. So want to watch it. This is a short video on how the lungs work. It's important in terms of understanding their relationship with the rest of the three systems, and also why it's so critical that we, make sure we find out if someone's breathing or not.
You can live for 2 weeks without food, 2 days without water, but only 2 minutes without air. Every single organ in your body is made up of cells, and they all require oxygen for you to live. Your lungs are part of the respiratory system, a group of organs and tissues that work together to help you breathe. The respiratory system's main job is to transport oxygen and remove extra carbon dioxide. Let's start by looking at the components of this important body system. The diaphragm is the main muscle for breathing. This dome-shaped wall of muscle does most of the breathing work by expanding and contracting the chest to draw air in and out of your lungs. When the diaphragm contracts, air is pulled into your airway through your nose or mouth. Air then travels down your airway, or trachea, dividing into your right or left lung via the bronchi. The bronchi then separate into small tubes called bronchioles. Like tree branches, bronchioles divide into thousands of even smaller passages. At the end of each bronchiole is a cluster of little air sacs called alveoli. Alveoli are wrapped in tiny blood vessels called capillaries. The air you breathe in fills these air sacs with oxygen-rich air. This is where the exchange of gases occurs. Carbon dioxide is the gas our body naturally produces. We must get rid of this waste gas. At this point, the capillaries are packed with carbon dioxide and the alveoli are full of oxygen. Oxygen crosses over from the alveoli into the capillaries where the red blood cells capture it. At the same time, carbon dioxide passes from the capillaries into the air sacs where it can be removed. The oxygen-rich blood cells are transported throughout the body, and the lungs exhale the carbon dioxide. This never-ending cycle keeps all parts of your body supplied with oxygen. Your lungs have developed a few defenses against constant exposure to particles in the air that you breathe in. Your bronchial tubes are lined with cilia, thin little hairs, and coated with mucus to capture these unwelcome intruders and sweep the mucus-coated particles back up to your throat until you cough, sneeze, or swallow to get rid of them. All day, every day, your lungs repeat this critical job of keeping your body supplied with the oxygen you need. That's why we say, when you can't breathe, nothing else matters. Learn more at lung.org.
Okay. That's basically how the lungs work, and you can see the way the lungs and the heart and the blood system and the neurological system are all interrelated. They all keep, they're any interruption in any one of them is going to be a problem. So this picture of the lungs. Here's what you're doing when you're, you're dealing with a, when you go to check to see if someone's breathing, you're looking and you're listening and you're feeling to see whether or not their lungs are working. The typical rate of breaths is 12 to 15 per minute. If somebody's breaths are way slower than 12, you have a problem. If they're way higher than 15, something else is going on, and it becomes a marker for us to try to figure out what's happening. So the mechanics are this. The lungs take in O2, oxygen, which is passed along to blood cells. Any disruption or obstruction to this process is an immediate life-threatening situation. In other words, if there's no air going in or not enough is getting in, then the blood can't get oxygenated, and that's not a good situation. It's possible to have an open airway, but still have difficulty breathing. This can be the result of an injury to the brain, the spinal cord, or the diaphragm. In this case, you may have to assist the patient with breathing if more advanced medical care is not available or until it arrives. This is called positive pressure ventilation or artificial respiration, also known as mouth to mouth. When you do this, protect yourself. If you don't have a breathing barrier, a breathing system that you can use, create a barrier for yourself. For example, take a piece of plastic, put a hole in it, and you breathe into the hole so that there's some protection for you from whatever germs or stuff that's coming out of your patient's mouth. Again, the rate of inflation should be about 12 breaths per minute, or 1 every 5 seconds. When you breathe in, it should be about 1 to 1.5 seconds long, and you want to be careful not to breathe too fast or too hard, because you'll force air into the stomach, which can lead to vomiting. Vomiting can lead to an obstructed airway. So, by way of a treatment for someone who's having breathing difficulty, what you need to do is you need to clear the airway to the extent that you can. So you have to look inside the mouth to see if there's something in there. You have to, I'll talk a little bit more about a treatment for that. Let me go on to the next system, the circulatory system. Another short video just to get a sense of how this all fits together.
Your heart is a pump. It's a muscular organ about the size of your fist and is located slightly left of center in your chest. Your heart is divided into the right and left side. The division protects oxygen-rich blood from mixing with oxygen-poor blood. Together, your heart and blood vessels comprise your cardiovascular system, which circulates blood and oxygen around your body. In fact, your heart pumps about 5 quarts of blood every minute, and it beats about 100,000 times in one day. That's about 35 million times in a year. Oxygen-poor blood, blue blood, returns to the heart after circulating through your body. The right side of the heart, composed of the right atrium and ventricle, collects and pumps the blood to the lungs through the pulmonary arteries. The lungs refresh the blood with a new supply of oxygen, making it turn red. Oxygen-rich blood, red blood, then enters the left side of the heart, composed of the left atrium and ventricle, and is pumped through the aorta to the body to supply tissues with oxygen. 4 valves within your heart keep your blood moving the right way. The tricuspid, mitral, pulmonary, and aortic valves work like gates on a fence. They open only one way and only when pushed on. Each valve opens and closes once per heartbeat, or about once every second. A beating heart contracts and relaxes. Contraction is called systole, and relaxing is called diastole. During systole, your ventricles contract, forcing blood into the vessels going to your lungs and body, much like ketchup being forced out of a squeeze bottle. The right ventricle contracts a little bit before the left ventricle does. Your ventricles then relax during diastole and are filled with blood coming from the upper chambers, the left and right atria. Then the cycle starts over again. Your heart is nourished by blood too. Blood vessels called coronary arteries extend over the surface of your heart and branch into smaller capillaries. Here you can see just the network of blood vessels that feed your heart with oxygen-rich blood. Your heart also has electrical wiring, which keeps it beating. Electrical impulses begin high in the right atrium and travel through specialized pathways to the ventricles, delivering the signal to pump. The conduction system keeps your heart beating in a coordinated and normal rhythm, which in turn keeps blood circulating. The continuous exchange of oxygen-rich blood with oxygen-poor blood is what keeps you alive.
Okay, circulatory system. As you can see, the heart and lungs work in tandem. When one is impacted, the other will soon be also. Similarly, when either of these systems is compromised, the third critical system, the nervous system, will soon start to fail. However, injury to the nervous system can adversely impact the other two systems because it is what keeps both the lungs and heart working. So these are the three big systems. These are the things we have to be most concerned about in our primary assessment, because these are any serious impact to any one of these three systems is life-threatening. So another short video on the nervous system, just to give you a little sense about how the complicatedness and the nature of this one. A little bit simple, but serves the purpose.
Our sense organs, which collect information from the surroundings, are connected to the central nervous system, which consists of brain and spinal cord through afferent nerves. If something happens that requires taking action, for example, if football is flying towards you, then the central nervous system receives impulses from the sense organ and it generates response which is carried to muscle through efferent nerve, and here that response will make the leg muscles contract to kick the ball. Though different sense organs work in different ways, they all keep sending information about the changes in the surroundings that trigger responses from the central nervous system.
Okay, pretty straightforward, but just a nice good review about how the system works. Okay, so the nervous system, the brain, the spine, and of course the nerves. The nervous system is the most fragile of the three life-supporting systems. This is why the brain is encased inside the skull, and the spinal cord is in the middle of the spine, which, by the way, is a truly remarkable bone structure because it allows it to flex in all kinds of different directions. Pretty amazing. The brain is what keeps your heart beating and your lungs working without you having to think about them. Injury through trauma or electricity or poisons, toxins, has the potential to cause the rest of your systems to break down. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, when one of these systems is severely compromised, the life of your patient is at risk. Okay, so let's talk about life support. Let's talk about what you do. Basic life support, that's what this is all about. Basic life support, as it says here, is the immediate treatment of one of the three life-threatening emergencies found during your primary survey. The purpose of BLS, basic life support, is to provide temporary support to keep the patient alive while a secondary survey is conducted and/or until advanced treatment is available. I'm going to suggest that you use what we call the ABCDE approach to trauma patients. I'll explain what each of these letters mean as I go through this, And along the way, I'll talk about some treatments or ways that you could help the patient at each of these stages. So A, B, C, D, E. A stands for airway. B stands for breathing. C stands for circulation and bleeding. D is for disability, and E is for exposure. Now that we have a basic understanding of the three most important systems that keep us alive, let's go back to the primary survey. Remember, first, make sure the scene is safe for you and the patients. Now go from patient to patient, determine who, if anyone, is experiencing a problem with one of these three systems. The simplest way to begin a primary survey is to ask the patient, how are you? If he answers, then you know that his airway is not obstructed, his heart is beating, so you've got A, B, and C covered, and the brain is functioning. If the patient does not respond or responds in an unusual way, you'll need to take a look more closely because there might be something wrong with the brain. As you do your primary survey, think in terms of A, B, C, D, E. As mentioned in the video on the respiratory system, an average person will lose consciousness after about 1 or 2 minutes of not breathing. Irreparable damage, brain damage, will happen 1 or 2 minutes after that, and death about a minute later. In other words, a person can live without breathing for a very, very short time. This means that the first thing you must do is check to see if the patient is breathing. Again, I want to say, if they can speak, they are breathing. If they are nonverbal, look for the chest rising and listen for breathing signs. If they are not breathing, check to see if the airway is obstructed. If it is not blocked, you will need to breathe for the patient. So, airway. A, is the airway blocked? If so, can you clear it? Things that block airways include the tongue, teeth, dentures, vomit, water, dirt, and swelling. This is not a all-inclusive list, but it gives you a pretty good idea of things that could be in there blocking the airway. By the way, the swelling could be inside the mouth, in the throat from it's like an allergic reaction or something. Breathing. Is the patient breathing? As I said, if the patient's not breathing, you need to start breathing for them. Airway problems are the result of an obstruction to the pharynx or the larynx. These are two parts of the breathing area. The obstruction can be complete or partial. A complete obstruction is rapidly fatal, but can be effectively and dramatically treated by clearing the airway. There are various ways an airway can become obstructed, as I've already pointed out. It is imperative that you clear the airway. First, look inside before clearing anything away. If necessary, use 2 fingers to sweep out the debris, but as you do so, do not cause any additional harm to the patient. You can also use the jaw thrust, which are the pictures show you there, or the chin lift if you don't suspect a head or neck injury. But mostly these days, we're only doing the jaw thrust. We're not really teaching the head tilt chin lift in first aid classes. If the patient is upright and starts choking and they can't talk, then you can try to force if there's something inside there. I once had a student who I was watching him eat, and I was amazed by how much he was shoving food, how fast he was shoving food into his mouth, when all of a sudden he stood up, grabbed his throat, and couldn't talk, and I was able to dislodge his retainer, a piece that he wore in his mouth, out of it, and it got caught up in his food and was blocking his throat. So sometimes if they're upright, you can help them by clearing the obstacle that way. But you have to open up the airway. So again, I've already shown you this picture, but just a reminder, look, listen, and feel. The normal respiratory rates are 12 to 20 minutes, 12 to 20 per minute. Moving on, now we're in the circulatory system. Basically, you need to have an uninterrupted circulation of blood in order to stay alive. On average, we have about 60 beats per minute. although some of us have a lower resting heart rates and some have slightly higher. But if you have an elevated pulse rate, then, and we'll talk about how to take a pulse in a little next slide, then it suggests there's a problem, and we need to figure out what the problem is. So in terms of an interrupted circulation of blood, there are two kinds of reasons why this could be happening. There could be basically cardiac arrest, that the heart has stopped beating. The heart's not beating, there's not going to be a pulse, there's not going to be blood circulating. Or it could be beating, but what's happening is that there's a break in the system. In other words, there's bleeding. And the bleeding could be outward, and you could see it pooling out, or you could see it spurting out. But the bleeding can also be inside. And that's more difficult to see, and of course, more difficult to respond to. So check to make sure that blood is not pouring out and that it is circulating. And we do that by taking a pulse. Here are some of the most common pulse points. The best place, the easiest place, providing the patient, you have a patient you can work with, is right here. We'll call it, I'm just going to call it on your wrist, but it's the radial. That's an easy place to find it. You can see my hand. Y'all have a picture of this also the carotid pulse. And there are other places where you can play around on yourself to feel where the pulses are. But that's your place. When you take a pulse, so this is a picture of taking the radial pulse. Okay, you're going to take 2 fingers with the palm up of the person whose pulse you're taking. You're going to look for the area between the wrist bone and the tendon on the thumb side. And then you're going to use the tips of your index and third fingers to feel the pulse in the radial artery. Apply just enough pressure so you can feel each beat. Don't push too hard or you'll obstruct the blood flow. Watch the second hand on your watch or clock as you count how many times you feel your pulse. I encourage you to practice doing this while I continue with this presentation. Try to feel your pulse. Do it with your colleagues. Check to see if you can find pulses. Some people, it's hard to find their pulse. You have to really work around to do it. Look for the pulse in different places. You can get this program when it gets put online. You can see where some of these other pulses spots are. Practice finding the pulse. This is looking for the carotid arteries. This one's really important because it's pumping the blood to the brain and the neck and the face. And you find that by placing your 2 fingers right there on the side, just below by your chin. Well, you can play around and try and find that. Okay, so there's no blood circulating, it's cardiac arrest. What are you going to do? Basically, you could do a hands-on CPR, a hands-only CPR. If you don't know CPR, if you do know CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, then you could add in the breaths. I'm not going to teach you CPR here, but but basically, it means you're compressing the chest, the heart to beat for it. Very difficult to do when you're in a remote situation, and it's in very rare occasions can you do it and then stop doing. And once you start doing it, when you stop, the patient's going to be dead. But while you're doing your primary survey, if you discover that the patient has no pulse, it means her heart has stopped beating and she is in cardiac arrest. But it's important to realize that under adverse situations, it can be really hard to find a pulse, or if the patient is in shock, it can be hard to find a pulse. So the carotid pulse is the strongest to feel and the easiest to access. So if you can feel a pulse there, that's good. If not, it's not good. Let me just say that even with hands-on training, CPR has limited potential, life-sustaining potential. Now, moving on to the other part of a problem with circulation, bleeding. All right. Second kind of disruption of circulation is caused by a major loss of blood. Blood loss must be controlled as part of your BLS. Bleeding can be eternal and both hard to identify and stop, or external, but not necessarily obvious. And where I live, in 6 months of the year, people are bundled up in coats because it's cold. And if someone's bleeding profusely inside their winter clothing, it can be hard to see the blood at first. or if they're bleeding into dirt and it might be hard to see it. So addressing internal bleeding is beyond the scope of what I can teach you and what most first responders can do in the field. That being said, external bleeding is controlled simply by direct pressure over the bleeding site with your hand, but preferably with a cloth or bandage. This is not to absorb the blood. It is to provide even pressure across the wound. Expect to apply direct pressure for 10 or more minutes. If the bleeding is not stopping, remove the bandage and check for the source of blood, and then reposition your hand to stop the bleeding. Use 2 fingers with direct pressure if necessary, and no peeking for 10 to 15 minutes. Alternatively, you can use a tourniquet, but I'm not going to talk about that in this presentation. Let's talk about disability, injury to the brain, spine, and nerves. Call this D for disability, but more specifically, does the patient have neurological damage which is causing the disability? In your primary survey, you are checking for trauma to the head, neck, or spine. Is there deformity, pain, or mechanism of injury suggesting an injury, for example, like a fall or an impact? If you have reason to suspect a head, neck, or back injury, stabilize the patient's head, neck, and spine by holding their head in place and moving them as little as possible. Assume a neck injury if there is a head injury, major injuries, or multiple broken bones, or the mechanism of injury suggests it. There are other reasons besides trauma that might be impacting the brain. For example, shock, an illness, lack of oxygen, blood loss, altitude. In the next slide, I'll introduce you to a convenient way to remember the different ways that impact the brain's ability to function. But part of assessing disability is to evaluate the patient's level of consciousness, LOC, we say. A standard way of assessing LOC is by the AVPU scale. So that is, A stands for they're awake, alert, and responds to verbal communications. Do they know who they are? Do they know where they are? Can they answer those questions? That's what we mean by verbal communication. V, they're verbal, meaning they respond to verbal stimulation, but they're not awake. The distinction between A and V is that, and it could be confusing, V means if I say, can you hear me? And the patient mumbles, this means they are responsive to verbal stimulation. But don't confuse this with being able to verbally answer a question. The next level is P. They're not awake. They're not responding to my verbal, commands or instructions, but they do respond to pain. So that's just telling me where they are in their level of consciousness. Finally, they're unresponsive altogether. They're not responding to pain or anything. That's one way to measure but injury to the brain, potential injury to the brain. Basically, we're talking about brain failure when these things are happening. Also, it's known as intracranial pressure, but brain failure is what's happening. There are various factors that can affect brain function. These include sugar, temperature, oxygen, pressure, electricity, altitude, toxins, and salts. And these actually all form a mnemonic which says, stop, eat. Now, you probably would need to have these notes written down or have a picture of this to help remember that, but these are ways that can affect the brain besides injury, and which you now need to address. So we're not talking about, trauma in the sense of an injury, but you're assessing brain failure, the disability. So is there a change in level of consciousness or memory loss? If there's none of those, then you don't have ICP or brain failure going on. But yes, if there is a change in level of consciousness or memory loss, or they have a severe headache or persistent vomiting, we like to say that every patient gets one free puke with their injury, but beyond that, you have more of a problem. If there's a change in level of consciousness, they went from A to P, or AV and they're working their way down. All of these things are evidence of ICP. No guarantee, but they're evidence, and now you have to treat them. So how do you treat ICP or brain failure? You treat them with what we call PROP. You protect them, you reassure them, you position them in a comfortable position, and you provide O2, oxygen, and or positive pressure ventilation if they need it. That's all you can do in the field when when someone has is having brain failure. The last thing on this was E, which is the environment or exposure. You need to protect your patients. Do not forget to do that. Is it shade that you need to provide for them? Is it warmth? Is it protection from rain or wind? But that's also important because the environment can exacerbate their conditions and introduce new problems. If it's a cold environment, it can introduce hypothermia, for example. So yeah, so exposure, that's the last part of it. Now I do want to touch on, because I have a couple more minutes, I want to touch on shock. There's two kinds of shock. There's what we call volume shock. Volume shock is a result of a loss of fluids, either through blood loss or dehydration. Volume shock is life-threatening. So if you're losing blood and you're just pouring out your blood, then everything's going to shut down. And what's going to happen is your body's going to compensate. It's going to cause your blood pressure to go up and your pulse rate to go up. And all it's trying to do is keep getting blood to your brain. So that's volume shock of loss of blood. But you can also have volume shock from dehydration or from diarrhea. You don't have the liquids in to keep the system going. Volume shock is life-threatening, bottom line. The other kind of shock is called acute stress reaction, often referred to as ASR. This is an emotional or psychological response to something. People will say, oh, they was in shock, they saw the accident, but that's not life-threatening. You need to treat it. You need to help a person calm them down, but it's not life-threatening. So classic symptoms for life-threatening shock are elevated pulse and respirations. Why? Because you're trying to bring in more oxygen and get rid of the carbon monoxide. And so you're breathing faster and harder, and your pulse rate is going up because you're trying to get the blood to the brain as much as possible. Your skin color might change. That's not as a reliable source. So I'm going to skip this last little bit about compensated and uncompensated shock. I'll talk about that later in a future presentation. So that brings me to wrapping up. And I wanted to wrap up. I wanted to share this a quote that is found in the Jewish sources in a book called the Talmud, and it's also found in the Quran. And it's really kind of I think an important sort of theological lesson to remember when we're learning first aid. And that is, when you save one life, it is as if you've saved the entire world. And as always, when I wrap up, I like to share this quote I heard from a Vermont State Trooper a few years ago. We don't rise to the occasion, we fall back on our training. I thank you all for coming out today and spending some time with me, reviewing or learning some basic life-saving skills and information, and for all what you do for your communities, your commitment by being here, and what you do on your job scenes. And lastly, I want to say I hope I'll see some of you in almost a little less than 2 weeks in Nairobi for the symposium, because I'll be there. And on that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and wrap up. Mohammed, I couldn't understand you. We're all garbled. So
Maybe that was an accident, but
okay.
we do have 10 minutes left. If anyone wants to ask any questions in that time, I'm sure Howard will be more than happy to answer anything. I saw throughout the training there were just 1 or 2 hands raised. And so now would be a great time to ask those questions. All right, well, if we don't have any questions, we can just transition into tea time.
Hold on, before you jump into that.
Mhm.
I'm going to push you guys. Nobody has any questions. Nobody has any experiences that you want to share, stories that you've had. You know, sometimes it takes a little time to come up with to formulate the question or the comment you want to make. So before Leah, before you run us to tea time, just gonna let it sit there for a second, because I bet there's somebody here who's got something on their mind, and so I'm gonna push you a little bit. It's nice that you're thanking me, but come up with a question. Adelino has.
We have Adelino.
Hello, Mr. Cohen.
Good to see you.
Yeah, how's it? How are you?
I'm great.
No, I'm all right. I'm great. I'm doing great. No, I just wanted to ask, like, in provision of the patient. So, you know, sometimes when you're in a situation that's far away, you're in the rain, or some places that's where it's hot, and then you don't have anything to provide with the shading of the patient with. Like what can you possibly provide with in sometimes?
So, you know, the answer to that question is the only thing that's limiting you from finding something is your imagination. You have to. There's something somewhere somehow. Who knows what that would be? But you just, you know, it depends on the situation, whether that means you're standing over them, or you put your shirt over them, or you pulled something out of the trash or out of a car. It so much depends on the situation. What's critical though is that once you've addressed the immediate life-threatening injuries, you have time. You have time to think and be creative, to find a solution to your situation. That being said, you know, if there's nothing there, there's nothing there. But you just have to try to figure out, be as creative. Well, that might mean also telling somebody who's people, stand buyers, go find me a tarp, go find me an umbrella, go find me a cold drink to put by this person. Give me some water so I can cool the person down. You have to do what you have to do. You have to just be as creative as possible. That's why it's called austere medicine, austere first aid, because you're trying to do you're doing what you can with what little you have.
All right, Mr. Cohen. There was something there. A person, like an ambulance, which was driving about minutes and minutes trying to find an ambulance. In a situation like that, how would you inform the hospitals in order to help others or to help the rescuers in order to bring the patients to the nearest hospitals? How would you, in your situation, how would you provide information to the hospitals?
Well, I mean, ideally you have radios in your ambulances, and you have radio communication with your hospital, and you'd be communicating with them with what's happening and you know what your patient is experiencing. And depending on your level of formal training and the resources you have in your ambulance, you would provide the care that you can. You know, obviously it's going to be different in every country. So here in sort of my community, we have in our ambulances, and by the way, we're never very far from a hospital for the most part, because it's just where we're located. But you're going to have EMT level people in the ambulance. You might have advanced EMT, or you might have paramedics and advanced paramedics. So EMTs cannot administer drugs, but a paramedic can. So paramedics on the radio with the hospital, and the hospital says, start administering such and such medication, he would do that. But it all depends on your relationship with the hospitals, and it's something you have to cultivate. It's a relationship you have to cultivate, and you do it at the practitioner's level by how you interact with the nurses and doctors when you bring your patients in. But it happens also at the senior level when you're chiefs and meet with the hospital staff and start work to establish some protocol that'll work for everybody. That's communications. And then if you're stuck in an ambulance and you can't get to a hospital and you don't have many resources, then you're back to an austere situation, and you do whatever you can to keep the patient alive. Easy to say, hard to do in real life.
Yeah.
All right, Leah, I think it's time. I think you can wrap it up. Thanks, everybody, for coming out.
Awesome. Do you have one more question, or are you just saying thanks?
Mr. Oko has his hand up.
Yeah, go ahead and ask your question.
Jackson, go ahead.
Hello,
Hand is raised. Go ahead.
hello, Mr. Owen.
Hello, go ahead.
My question is about you can touch about the burns. Those you can touch about burns.
Burns.
How you can handle a patient that has injuries of burns.
Burns. Okay, it's a great question, and it's going to be. I'm going to give you a teaser answer. You're going to have to come to another session that I'll do, and I'll get into burns. Burns in general, unless they're affecting the lungs, are not life-threatening in the immediately. But I'll give you the short answer for treating burns. You need to protect them, and there's not much you can do for them in a remote in a austere situation. But having said that, I'll talk more about burns when I get into more the next sessions down the road, and we'll talk about different degrees of burns and how you can treat them, and burns and where burns necessitate an evacuation as soon as possible. For example, not all burns require, you don't necessarily have to evacuate someone as urgently, but I'll talk more about burns at a future training. And I'm glad you asked the question.
And then it looks like we have one more question before we wrap up. Mohammed, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Good afternoon here in Nigeria.
Good afternoon. Go ahead.
All right. I just discovered. I want to commend the guest speaker, and I also want to our resource person, and I want to say something about what I just got to know today. The ABCDE, the exposure is a new thing to me. So what we've been used to is that of airways, breathing, circulation, and defibrillator. That is the D there is defibrillator. Now the D has changed here, and E is added as D and E, exposure. I want to know, please, if you can quickly clarify again, how does the D and the E? So please, I need a little clarification.
Okay.
And whether it is different from defibrillator.
Right, so D is. Oh, that's good. So good questions. So one of the things that you're alluding to is that training, first aid training is constantly evolving. We're learning more and more. We're modifying. We're discovering some of the teachings that we used to do are not as accurate or as helpful. For example, CPR has changed a lot if you've been taking it over the years. So the D, by referring to disability, it just makes it for an easy mnemonic, A, B, C, D. D talking about the disabilities being a neurological disability. So you're disabled if you've broken both legs, right? You can't walk. You have but so we use just the D to talk about brain injuries, whether they're trauma to the spine, trauma to the neck, or trauma to the brain. And brain trauma can come through so many different forces, through different ways. So that's where how the D fits in, and it is an extension. In some first aid classes, they just teach A, B, and C: airway, bleeding, and airway bleeding, and I don't remember what C used to be. I don't even remember now. But when you try to create a mnemonic, they don't always work they're not always airtight. So the D is, the first A, B, C, and D, those are life-threatening. The E is added in because it's easy to forget that a person's condition can change dramatically because of the environment. So it fits in. Now, 2 years from now, the first aid instructors, when I do my refresher, maybe they'll drop the E out of it and they say, well, it makes things complicated. But it's just, the exposure could potentially lead to a life-threatening situation, but it's just, it's a reminder that that our care of our patient also requires us paying attention to the environment. There's also a bias. A lot of the first aid training I've done is oriented towards the winter and mountaineering. And so the environment, hypothermia and cold-related injuries are a big problem or a big concern. And those could easily, sneak in on people. So I think that's one of the reasons why that was added into the formula A, B, C, D, and E. That being said, as the previous question, as Adelino asked about shade, how do you give shade to somebody? As you know, you need shade sometimes. So the environment does that. That's where the E fits in. Hope that answers your question.
Awesome. Thank you so much for staying around, answering those questions. And we also invite you, Howard, if you want to stay for tea time. I know you usually do, but if you don't have to, it's not required. But I do invite you to do that. Stay around, answer a couple more questions. I know it's a really big, dense topic that we went over today, so I'm sure there's even more questions that haven't yet to be asked. But as we're wrapping up, I just want to remind everybody about our certificates. Once more, you have to attend 70% of the training if you want that certificate. It usually looks like 45 minutes if it's an hour-long training, which it was. And so if you attended the 45 minutes, you'll be getting a certificate. But I do also want to just throw out a little gauging of interest. If you guys would, if we recorded these, which we already do record these and we post them on YouTube, but if we posted them into a Google Classroom instead, and you wrote a paragraph about it, if you weren't able to attend the actual meeting and you only watched the videos, a lot of times we get questions of, hey, I couldn't attend the training, but I watched the YouTube video. Can I still get my certificate? And right now the answer is no, just because we don't have any way of tracking to see if you did watch the video. But if we gave it as an option where you wrote a paragraph, just what you learned or your favorite part of the lesson, whatever it is, and then you submit that paragraph and in return you get a certificate. And so please just let me know in the chat. You can text out if you would be interested in that or not. We don't know if people would like to do that and don't want to do all that if you guys wouldn't be interested in. So that was just a question for you guys today as we're wrapping up. And so now we can head on to tea time with Jose. But yes, I do just invite everybody back next week to next week's training. Follow the same link that you followed today. And feel free to always share that link with your colleagues or your friends in the fire service. We've grown so much over this past year and it's been so amazing to see. And so let's just keep that up, keep inviting people, keep sharing our social media, invite people to join the Facebook networking group. And so it's just so great to see everybody every week. And I will see you all next week. So bye-bye.